Good evening and a very warm welcome. Firstly, I would like to thank everyone who has taken the time to join us this evening to be part of Glasson Fertiliser's very first webinar. My name is Nigel Hayton and I am the National Fertiliser Trading Manager at Glasson Fertiliser, and I will be chairing tonight's webinar. I joined Glasson Fertiliser in May 2013, trading fertiliser through our merchant and agent network. And I have worked in the fertiliser industry for 17 years, getting my FACTS qualification in 2008. You will have the opportunity to submit any questions you may have during tonight's webinar, and they will be covered in a Q&A at the end. There will also be an opportunity to claim facts and basis points, and information will be given at the end of the Q&A session. We have three presenters this evening. Firstly, Hannah Shirt. For the last decade, Hannah has worked as a forage specialist, delivering on-farm advice. Hannah uses analysis to gauge a farmer's nutritional requirements before recommending any fertiliser grades. Hannah is FACTS qualified and has also completed her basis soil and water qualification. Hannah has a wealth of knowledge of analysis, interpretation of soil, leaf and organic manure analysis, and an interest in helping farmers recover as much applied nutrients as possible. Secondly, we have Kevin Havocus, Kilwaughter's basis and FACTS qualified agronomist. Kevin Havocus has expertise in soil health, soil pH management and soil nutrition. With over 20 years experience, Kevin provides practical advice to merchants, agronomists and farmers, providing them with the tools they need to ensure their agricultural businesses can grow sustainably and profitably. And lastly, Francis Pickering, Glasson Fertilisers Commercial Manager for the East, a farmer's son from near Whitby in the North Yorkshire Moors National Park. Francis has been with Glasson Fertilisers for 4 years, having worked in the agricultural industry with a background of grain procurement and fertiliser and seed sales. So without any further ado, I would like to hand you over to our first speaker for this evening, Hannah Shirt from Lancrop.
Good evening and thank you for joining us, and thank you too to Nigel for that kind introduction. If you haven't heard of us before, Lancrop Laboratories specialise in the analysis of soil and plant nutrition. We have a wealth of experience in this field and we have been operating since the mid-1970s. We are based in Pocklington in Yorkshire, but we do analyse material from all over the world. We analyse over 250,000 soils each year, and the numbers are increasing all the time. As I said previously, we specialise in soil and plant nutrition. We predominantly test soil, but we also test leaf tissue, grain, manures, digestates, even sometimes lime and fertiliser. So there are a few reasons why you would analyse soils. If you know what you have as a starting point, then you can make an informed decision about how much fertiliser you need to apply. I always think of this as a win-win situation because it can be unnecessary, not to mention costly, to apply more bagged fertiliser than is required. And if you don't apply sufficient nutrient to meet that crop demand, then you could lose out in terms of yield loss. So again, it's costly. You can also work out how much you need to apply, but it doesn't mean to say that that applied nutrient actually gets available for plant uptake. And this is probably the most costly of all. And I'm going to come on to this in the next slide and cover that in a bit more detail. Another reason to analyse is to keep compliant with the ever-changing legislation. In March 2018, the Water Framework Directive was updated and we were issued with these new farming rules for water, which is where farmers are expected to sample for phosphate, potassium, magnesium and pH, and this applies to any field which has received a manure or fertiliser application. and then was subsequently harvested or grazed. And when those farming rules for water were released, farmers had to ensure all their fields had a sample that was no more than 5 years old. So back then you could sample a proportion of the farm each year, maybe a fifth or a quarter of the farm each year. But now spring 2023 is approaching, and that sees that 5 years grace period, if you like, finishing. And it is now expected that all farms will have a valid analysis report for each field, and that analysis has to have been done by a laboratory. In the last couple of years, there have been various voluntary schemes, such as the ELM scheme, or it's SFIs, the Sustainable Farming Incentive. That's in England. And we've also got a similar scheme, the Preparing for Sustainable Farming, or PSF, in Scotland. And there are set criteria to meet. And for example, in both levels of the SFIs that have been released, organic matter sampling by a laboratory is required. Some farmers have also found that their milk buyers have requested soils to be tested, and this is usually along similar lines: phosphate, potassium, magnesium, the pH, organic matter, and sometimes the soil texture. What I think is a real shame is that calcium is not part of that required test. Most other countries do analyse for calcium, but the UK don't currently. And I think it's a shame, because it does actually tell you a lot about your soil. So I mentioned briefly that it's possible to apply fertiliser that doesn't get recovered for plant uptake, and that is really down to the pH. This image shows this in a bit more detail. So you see the pH scale runs across the top, so from 4 to 10 on here, and that you'll also see the macronutrients. So that's nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium. So nitrogen's in green, phosphate red, potassium purple. And you see the thickest lines there, so the most availability is between 6.5 and 7.5. So that becomes your optimum range. So if your soil falls below that optimum, then the optimum pH of 6.5, then you can see how that availability begins to tail off. And that's quite rapidly in the case of phosphorus. And that's because it tends to lock up with some of the metals, so aluminium and iron, at that lower pH. There will also be a negative effect on the soil biology. So once that pH drops, we start to see a fall in the number of bacterial numbers, and we also see fewer earthworms. They don't seem to thrive in the more acidic conditions. So because there is less bacterial activity, you start to see less mineralization. Less mineralization means less cycling of the organic nutrients that are contained within that organic matter that we're testing for quite predominantly at the moment. And then on the other hand, you can see on the right hand side of that bar that when the pH is above 7.5, you see problems again with phosphorus, but also with the micronutrients. They don't seem to like the more alkali soils. So the micronutrients, as it sounds, you need a lot less of them than you do the macronutrients. And sometimes this can work in your favour to have your pH slightly higher, because those some of those nutrients, and I'm thinking more of the metals like iron and aluminium, they become less available. So again, it's another reason why you need to keep your pH above that sort of 6.5 target. So putting this onto a bar chart for nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium, you can see the impact that pH has a bit more clearly here. So an ideal pH shows 100% possible availability, whereas a soil with a pH of 5.0 shows losses of nitrogen and potassium nearly half, and phosphate even more. So only only a third of phosphate will be recovered at a pH of 5.0. So put in really plain terms, if you applied a fertiliser to a soil of 5.0, how much would you waste? If we take 20-10-10, and that's purely because my maths is so bad, you might have bought a 20-10-10, but the impact of that low pH means the maximum uptake is more like a fertiliser containing 10-3-10. such a 10.35, sorry. So where prices are where they are, it is really like becoming even more important to maintain that pH. And that's without thinking of the cost to the environment when that nitrogen leaches, which is, you know, again, is something that the Environment Agency are getting really hot on. So before I wrap up, I'm just going to show our sort of flagship soil analysis report. This is our broad spectrum soil health, which includes the Solvita. And I'll start with the chemical section, which is I've just highlighted there. This we have a traffic light system here. So anything that's red shows a deficiency. The green bars are all sufficiencies, and then the blue lines are when the results are above the optimum range. So we don't test for nitrogen; it's just too mobile. And then you see there in the first box, there's the macronutrients, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium, and then in the box below, we have the secondary and micronutrients. So this is showing quite a healthy soil. We often see that the sulfur results, I'll just go back there so you can see that sulfur results is red, and we often see that. I would say probably 97% of soil that we analyse for sulfur are deficient now, and that's really down to the Clean Air Act, which I'm sure you've heard about previously. Sodium and iodine are usually also low. Iodine's not on this report, but sodium is, and that's really down to the behaviour of those nutrients in the soil. So moving on to the physical, which I've just highlighted there, this is where we test the percentage of sand, silt and clay using laser diffraction. And on the left-hand side of that part of the report, you'll see that nice colourful triangle. And this gives you, this plots and gives you a soil texture classification. And this really helps you to understand how to feed your soil. So a light sandy soil, they do better when they're fed little and often, whereas a more clay soil can be fed less frequently. So moving on to the biology, here we measure how well the soil biology respires. And we do this by drying, milling and sieving the soil in the usual way. And then we re-wet the soil and place it in a sealed container with a CO2, a carbon dioxide sensitive strip. The strip changes colour, and then that denotes the microbial activity. Because the bacteria in soil are very much like us. They breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. So that's why we use the carbon dioxide burst as a measure of the microbial activity. So you can see there we have the microbial biomass, and that colourful chart at the bottom, that nice bar where it starts red and goes to purple, that shows the pH impact on soil biology, which I've just sort of gone through a few minutes ago. So finally, we have the soil characteristics, and here we have the pH, the organic matter, also the cation exchange capacity, which is the soil's inherent ability to hold on to nutrients. This isn't something that you can change too much, but if you haven't measured it, then you can't manage it. It's that old adage, measure to manage. So to summarise, if you only remember one thing from this presentation, it's that pH is the absolute cornerstone of good soil health. If you get that right, you can hope that everything else will fall into place. But you can be sure if it isn't right, then it's pretty impossible that anything else will be. Secondly, soil analysis shouldn't focus solely on chemical fertility. Remember to consider the physical and biological sides too, because they are all very much interlinked. And finally, just keep in mind the legislation and make sure that you're compliant and that you've kept really good records, because it all helps if you do get an inspection. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to pass over now to Kevin. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Hannah. That was a really informative presentation. A lot of good information in there. So early on in my career, I was fortunate enough to travel with a sales rep that had been on the road for 40 years and give me a bit of training. And he was quite fond of telling me and everyone that he would meet that his health was his wealth. In response to people asked him how he was doing, and I think it was always I always thought it was a very poignant response. And I think it's very applicable to us in the farming community in that the wealth of our farm really rests in the health of our soil. There's not a lot of revenue, I don't think, on the farm level that can't be drawn back to the state of the soil health if you trace the lines back. So it's really important to make sure that we get the foundational building blocks in place to ensure that we have good soil health. So the very first thing I tell farmers to look at when they're looking at soil health is drainage and compaction. If the soil is poorly drained, if the soil is compact, water infiltration will be poor, oxygenation of the soil will be poor, the roots won't be able to make their way through the soils. So you'll have poor anaerobic bacteria working, and that gives that kind of musty smell off the soil. And you don't have the nice aerobic microbes that Hannah was referring to. Doing the things that they're supposed to be doing to help keep the soil operating the way it's meant to. So if you can get drainage, put drains in where they're needed and do subsoiling and the like to loosen up compaction issues, that's going to be money really well spent, and that's the first foundational building block. The second thing to look at will be your soil pH, and as Hannah referenced, as your pH begins to drop below 6.0, your nutrients start to get locked up, and that means that that your soil is not going to perform and grow the crops that it needs to grow. You're not going to recover the nutrients that you need to recover. So the second thing to look at is your soil acidity. Then the third thing to look at would be your macronutrients, your P's, your K's, your magnesium and calcium levels, and make sure that those are in the appropriate indices to make sure that they're available to the crop. Keeping in mind that your soil analysis report is only going to measure the amount of available nutrient. So if your pH is reading 5.5, it's going to show a different level of available nutrient than if your pH is reading 6.5. So when you're doing your soil analysis, once you've corrected your soil pH, it's a good idea to do another soil test to understand where your indices are and apply the nutrients appropriately. Once you've addressed those three core building blocks, then you can start to fine tune and play with things like biostimulants and humic and fulvic acids and foliar sprays and that sort of thing to fine tune and get that little bit extra that you're going for. But if you don't have those three foundational blocks in place initially, then you're just throwing away your money trying to fine tune things when there's much bigger things that are missing. So when it comes to soil acidity and what's really been happening, if we go back to 1945, there was a lime grant that was put into place, and prior to that, soils had been becoming acidic, but nutrient levels, total nutrient reserves were building up in the soil. So the lime grant came into effect, and every 5 years, farmers were putting on lime to make the nutrients more available to the crop. And over time, that mined the soil of the nutrients that had been building up because they were made more available as the pHs were brought up to where they needed to be. And once pHs got where they needed to be about 1977, that was about the same time as the advent of compound fertilizer, and farmers would see a massive response from getting just one bag of fertilizer on. As time went on, lime usage began to decrease, soils became more acidic, fertilizer usage started to grow, and farmers weren't getting the same response from a single bag, so they put 2 bags and 3 bags on in order to get the response that they used to get from a single bag. So the impact of fertilizer is now quite low. The professional agricultural analysis group has recently published a report showing that only 17% of UK soils are in the optimal pH range. So we really need to look at what we're doing in terms of our farming practices and how we can increase our pH to make sure that our nutrient use efficiency is adequate. And the take-home message there, as Hannah was showing earlier, a pH of 6 just is not good enough with 11% of your nitrogen, 48% of your phosphate, being unavailable to the crop at that pH of 6. And most guys, when they get their soil analysis back and they see a pH of 5.8 or 5.9, think they're not too far off 6 or 6.5, and so they're not too worried about it. But it's important to keep in mind that the pH scale is logarithmic, and that means a pH of 6 is 10 times more acidic than a pH of 7, but a pH of 5 is 100 times more acidic than a pH of 7. So that 0.1 from 6.1 to 6 or 6 to 5.9 makes a huge difference in terms of nutrient availability. And as pH comes down to 5.5, which we see a lot of soil analysis reports coming back at, that means 23% of your nitrogen, 23% of your potash, and 52% of your phosphate is unavailable to the crop. And to put that in terms of real money, looking at fertilizer, a 2744 blend, for instance, at a cost of 600 pounds a ton, even at a pH of 6, you're losing 90 pound out of every ton of fertilizer that's getting locked into the soil, and the plant can't access those nutrients. And as your pH drops further to 5.5, you're losing 150 pounds of fertilizer. So it's really, really key that we make sure that we're maintaining our soil pH. So what's happening when we're putting lime on the ground? So your pH is measuring the potential for hydrogen to be in the soil, and the hydrogen is what's making the soil acidic. And as we put lime on the soil, lime is comprised of either calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate. So as the calcium carbonate goes onto the soil, the calcium and the carbonate is reacting with the hydrogen ions, two hydrogen ions, and then you're getting the formation of water, carbon dioxide, and calcium. So the water obviously moves into the pore spaces in the soil. The carbon dioxide is respired by the soil, and oxygen replaces it, so the soil is becoming oxygenated, and then calcium is also forming in the soil and increasing the amount of calcium. Calcium we don't talk about enough. It's vitally important to the crop to make sure that there's enough calcium there, and Francis will get into some of the offtakes of calcium later in his presentation, but it's really the king of all nutrients. There's more interactions between calcium and other elements in the soil than any other nutrient. Calcium is a major constituent of cell walls, so it really helps to get strength into the wall of the plant, so it's more resistant to insect attack, it's more resistant to disease and fungal attack. So a healthy calcium enriched crop will be more resilient, less susceptible to lodging, potentially need fewer fungicides, that sort of thing. Also really key to note is that calcium can act as a piggyback or a channel for trace elements such as boron or zinc to get into the plant. So even if your soil test levels are showing that you have an adequate amount of those trace elements in the soil, but if your calcium levels are low, you may end up with a crop that's showing a deficiency in those trace elements because they're not able to get into the crop because there's not enough calcium in the soil to facilitate that. So we really need to talk a little bit more about calcium and make sure that we're paying attention to those calcium levels in our soil and replenish them annually. When it comes to the impact of liming and what it can do for a crop, the world's oldest ongoing experiment is at Park Grass, done by Rothamsted, and what they're showing in these trials that were the data published from 2012 to 2016 is with an untreated soil where the pH is roughly 5.0 and never gets any lime. The hay is yielding 1.1 ton to the acre of dry matter with no fertilizer at all. In the plots where they're maintaining the pH at 6.0, that yield increase goes up to 1.4 ton per acre of dry matter or grass, and where the pH is maintained at 7, and you'd see a very similar response at a pH of 6 based on the charts that Hannah was showing at pH of 6.5. You're getting 1.5 tons per acre of dry matter versus 1.1, so that's a 0.4 ton per acre yield advantage without any fertilizer at all, just on what the soil is naturally supplying. So when it comes to lime and choice of lime on the farm, there's a variety of choices. There's granulated limes and there's a variety of conventional agricultural limes from screened right down to ground limes. And it's really important to make sure that regardless of the lime you choose, that you're choosing a high quality lime. A lime that's very fine or soft and will rapidly dissolve a lime that has a high neutralizing value above 50 is going to give you a better reaction than a hard lime or a very coarse lime with a low neutralizing value. There's a place on the farm for conventional agricultural lime. There's a place on the farm for granulated lime, and it's about choosing the right time and the place in order to address the needs of your farm and your farming practices and finding the methods that suit you the best. I find often in a field that's going to arable or a field that's being plowed where the pH is running at 5.6 or 5.5 or below, that's a really great place to put conventional lime into the crop and ensure that that you're getting some heart and some long-term carry into that soil to really give it a bit of robustness and lift the soil up to a pH that can be more easily managed with a granulated lime. Conversely, with a pH of 5.7, 5.8 or above, you can fairly easily manage that with a granulated lime over the course of 3 or 4 years, build up to your target, and then go with a maintenance dose annually. And in a future slide here, I'll show you exactly why that's important or how that can work. But really, really important to note the quality of the lime that you're getting. So you should be asking your lime supplier for a certificate to find out what the reactivity, what the neutralizing value, what the fineness is. The EU have recently passed regulations saying that 70% of lime should be below 1 millimeter in size. So what they're really saying there is that finer limes are more reactive and do the job faster and react a lot quicker. So particles over 500 micron or half a millimeter in size are very ineffective. So if they're being applied to an established grassland, for instance, you get those coarse particles that sit on top of the soil. The hydrogen that's around that particle is only going to react with the outside of that particle, and there's not enough hydrogen to penetrate to the inside. So you find you'll have a lot of inert material sitting on top of the soil and not actually washing its way into the soil fissures and giving you a reaction. And that's only going to occur with mechanical movement of that particle through the soil profile to mix it in. So if you're going with established grassland, it's not really an ideal product for that if it's a coarser material. And the granulated lime can work really, really well in that situation because it dissolves very quickly within with an inch of rain. Within 6 weeks of application, it's fully dissolved and fully reacted, and it's working its way through the soil fissures and neutralizing the soil throughout the root zone. So this just goes to show when you start at a pH of 5.5 and you put on 2 ton per acre of conventional agricultural lime as depicted by the gray line, it can take up to 18 months depending on the coarseness of material to lift your pH to your target. Once there, it may maintain the pH at that target for about 18 months before it begins to decline at a rate of 0.1 or 0.2 per year until you get back to year 5 and you're where you started, and then another 2 ton to the acre at that time will raise your pH. Again, can take up to 18 months, and what you're left with is this gap of approximately 3 years where your pH has been suboptimal, your yields have been lower, and your fertilizer response has been lower as a result. So regardless of how you get to your pH, what we would advocate with granulated lime is a maintenance dressing every year. 100 kilos to the acre is enough to maintain your pH through the growing season. You may have a decline in pH of 0.1 or 0.2 during the rainy winter months, but that application again in the spring, 100 kilos to the acre, is often enough to maintain your pH at target. So showing again how granulated lime or lime itself can work with fertilizer and as a partner to fertilizer. Again, the park grass experiments using fertilizer, 2.8 ton per acre dry matter on the untreated soil, which is a pH of roughly 5.0 versus 3.3 at the pH when the soil pH is maintained at 6 versus 3.5 ton of dry matter per acre when the pH is maintained at 7. So plus 0.7 ton per acre dry matter yield advantage with fertilizer when the soil pH is maintained above 6. So it really is a financial no-brainer. If you compare the cost of 2 ton of agricultural lime every 5 years over a 20-year period versus a program where you started at a pH of 5.7 or 5.8 and put on 250 kilos per acre of granulated lime in year 1, 200 kilos per acre in year 2, 150 kilos per acre in year 3, and years 4 through 20, 100 kilos per acre. You'll end up spending roughly £40 per acre less on the granulated lime program than you would have on the conventional lime program. So thank you for your time this evening, and I'll pass it over to Francis now for his presentation.
Yeah, good evening everybody, and thank you, Kevin, for a really good insight there into the role and use that calcium plays on farm. So without further ado, I'd like to start my my presentation. So I'm going to start this evening with von Liebig's law of the minimum, which some of you might be aware of. So here we have a barrel, for example, representing the soil, and we give it some water and we give it some sunshine, and we can hopefully grow a crop. So there's 13 nutrients there essential to plants that we need to grow a successful crop, and the nutrients are represented there by the staves of the actual barrel. And the capacity of the barrel therefore is limited to the length of the shortest stave. So similar to plant growth, where it is limited by the nutrient in shortest supply, which must be supplemented obviously to optimize growth. So we've got some major plant nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphate and potash, and we've got some secondary nutrients such as magnesium, calcium and sulfur, and then we have trace elements such as manganese, copper, zinc, boron, iron, chlorine and molybdenum. So now most nutrients are absorbed through the root hairs of the plant, and it is vital to know the soil mineral status. Now this is best achieved by soil analysis, as Hannah has previously mentioned, and we should be testing for all nutrients basically, which can affect the plant development, the plant quality, and also plant disease. So plant stress and disease resistance are affected by nutrient deficiencies, and nutrients in excess can be as detrimental as a nutrient deficient, such as excess phosphate, where that can depress the plant uptake, and it could affect the uptake of magnesium, for example, or copper and zinc. Now, standard recommendations in the AHDB nutrient management guide for phosphate and potash fertiliser are based on ensuring that the soil has sufficient reserves to supply the crop during its growth period. Now, this is measured by soil analysis and using the index system here in England. So for agricultural cropping, we'd be looking for a soil phosphorus index of 2 or 3 and a potassium index of 2, where they're generally considered sufficient to supply the full needs of the crop during its growth. But as Hannah and Kevin have already mentioned, actually, if the pH is not at target, then the availability of those nutrients can be greatly reduced. So at recommended target indices, the fertiliser recommendation is to replace the nutrients removed at harvest, and often this is called the offtake, and these are called maintenance dressings to replace that offtake. But we're replacing the calcium offtake as well, and that's something I'll come on to later. So standard book values that we use for estimated offtakes, in the case of potash, these quantities could be considered low than the nutrient uptake by the growing crop. As we can see here on the chart, the book standard value for an 8 ton per hectare winter wheat crop would be about 45 kilograms per hectare of K2O, the offtake in the grain. But as we can see here, the crop can actually uptake as much as 300 kilograms per hectare during the growing season, and this has got to be taken up from the soil reserve, which hopefully is no lower than a K index of 2, again with the correct pH. So much of the potash in the crop is actually returned to the soil as the crop matures. We can see that it tails off it reduces towards harvest, but there's still a considerable amount retained in the straw, and again, if the straw removed at harvest, then that's going to result in a greater offtake from the field. A natural pattern of uptake of minerals such as potassium, magnesium, sodium and calcium varies during the course of the grass growing season, as with a growing cereal crop. Now, most of us are aware that the dry matter of young, rapidly growing grass, especially in the spring, has a high potassium content, and this declines as the season progresses, but actually the reverse happens to calcium, sodium and magnesium. So while the concentration of these minerals actually increase through the growing season. So we need to be looking at applying a correct balance of nitrogen, phosphate and potash. They're essential to obtain the best yields of forage. I think that's pretty common practice. But in addition, their effect upon yield, the nitrogen and potash fertilizers influence greatly the mineral content of the grass, especially the magnesium, the sodium and the calcium. So we're looking to apply an adequate supply and balance of these minerals to minimize risk of metabolic disorders such as staggers or grass tetany, milk fever, and also to ensure that the herd fertility is not compromised in any way. So establishing a crop is all about root miles, and this is where the function of calcium is vitally important. Calcium is found in its greatest amounts in cell walls. It is utilized in cell division and nitrogen metabolism. It controls the uptake of water by cell colloids, which are the living protoplasm of plant cells. Calcium helps improve root weight, and it also has an indirect effect on the growth of the plant by altering the availability of certain other nutrients available to the plant, and also preventing the toxic effect of other nutrients that might be present. For example, high levels of potassium in the soil, or magnesium, or sulfur and boron, for example, in the soil may cause an imbalance, and therefore, if we see an imbalance, we see abnormal performance of the plant function. And this chart just explains some of the root growth that can be achieved by some common plants, and so that the shoot growth is in grams per square meter. So we can see there, we've got some plants there growing at 20 grams per meter squared per day, and root length is measured in kilometers per square meter. And again, from that chart, we can see that there's some plants there growing at 200 meters per meter squared per day. So the crop, when it's establishing, certainly has a big demand on calcium. So typical phosphate and potash offtakes can be found in the AHDB Nutrient Management Guide. And this is in section 4 of the arable crops, page 20 and table 4.11. And the values shown here, these are agreed best estimates of the quantities of phosphate of P2O5 and potash K2O removed in harvested crops, and also in byproducts such as straw, for example. These are offtakes of phosphate and potash per ton of fresh material harvested. Therefore, to maintain the nutrient fertility of the soil, and the total offtake must be replaced. And this can be done through the use of fertilizers, manufactured or otherwise, and also the use of manures. Where the crop yield is expected to differ from the standard values in the nutrient guide, then the recommendations can be adjusted using these offtake values. So, for example, using the book standard value of an 8 ton per hectare winter wheat crop with the straw chopped, so that's staying in the field, so it's grain only offtake. We at 8 tons per hectare, we would be removing 52 kilograms per hectare of phosphate, and we would be removing 44 kilograms per hectare of potash. So whereas the recommendation for phosphate and potash can be found in the Nutrient Management Guide, there are no recommendations as such really for calcium. And as we've discussed so far, calcium is vital for plants to establish and to function. Therefore, should we not be calculating the calcium offtake as well? So Kevin highlighted earlier in the possible hunger gap with a traditional 1 year in 4 bulk liming strategy. We could see points throughout the year where the pH and the availability of those nutrients may dip and decrease and not be as available. So just looking at this chart here, based on grain and straw removal for barley and wheat and oats, where we assume that the straw yield is 60% of the grain yield, we can see for every 1 ton per hectare of fresh weight yield, we remove 0.6 kilograms per hectare of calcium in the straw alone. And then also we need to add in the offtake in the grain as well. So again, using 8 tons per hectare, which is book standard values, For an 8 tonne per hectare yield, we would remove 4.8 kilograms per hectare in the straw and 3.3 kilograms per hectare in the grain. Similar as for cereal crops, in the nutrient management guide, there's no off-take guide really for calcium, and the same should be applied to grass, and therefore we should be treating our grass crop the same as we would a combinable crop to address its requirements and off-takes, and to apply fertilisers and manures to achieve a balanced nutrient supply to the growing crop. So I've taken here an example of a grass sward grazed in situ over the summer, and where we're applying circa 20 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen a week, or 75 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen per month, to hit a target of 25 tonnes per hectare of fresh weight, or 3.75 tonnes per hectare of dry matter. And at that rate, which is a pretty standard rate, we will be removing 31.5 kilograms per hectare of calcium over that period, which would need the equivalent of 63 kilograms per hectare of a 50% calcium content lime just to replace. Again, I'll go back to Kevin's earlier slide, where are we not surely better applying a little and often approach of a regular application of a readily available calcium product, such as calling it a fertiliser partner, I think Kevin called it, rather than applying a large dose of calcium 1 in every 4 years. So just to summarise on some grazed grass basics, grazed grass in situ over 4 months, looking to produce 100 tonne per hectare of fresh weight, or 15 tonnes per hectare of dry matter. We should be looking at a balanced approach of 2 units of nitrogen per day, or 75 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per month, with our pH at optimum, of course, to achieve the maximum quality, maximum availability of those nutrients. With the target index 2 for phosphate, we would only need to apply 20 kilograms actually per hectare of a water-soluble fertiliser or some manure, and at an index target of 2+ for potash, there'll be no additional application required. But not forgetting sulphur, ideally, we should be looking for a nitrogen sulphur ratio of 10 nitrogen to 1 S, or 2.5 SO3, and we should be looking to apply somewhere around 19 kilograms per hectare, or 25 units of SO3 there. And finally, just before my last slide, I would like to mention and highlight the acidifying effect of applying manufactured nitrogen fertilisers. Here we have 4 common forms of bagged nitrogen fertiliser products commonly used on farm to apply nitrogen to the growing crop. And we can see here for every kilogram of nitrogen applied in the form of ammonium sulfate, then we would need to apply 2.4 kilograms of lime to counteract the acidity effect on the soil pH. For ammonium nitrate and urea, we would both need 1.2 kilograms per hectare of lime there for every 1 kilogram of nitrogen applied. And the least acidifying nitrogen product there would be calcium ammonium nitrate, which, as the name suggests, is 20% calcium content and 80% ammonium nitrate. Total nitrogen content is 27%. If we're using the CAN, the CAN product, as our nitrogen source, then we would only need to apply 0.4 kilograms of lime for every kilogram nitrogen applied. So just lastly on nitrogen, if we look at any yield response to applied nitrogen in grain or grass, then usually we would expect 50% supplied to the crop from the actual soil nitrogen, and the rest supplied would be in the form of applied nitrogen. Hence the need to keep our nutrient soil profile in balance and in an available form to the growing crop. So just on my last slide now, just to summarise on some winter cereal basics, some guidelines, again using the book standard 8 tonne per hectare yield with straw removed. We should be looking at a balanced approach of nutrients with our pH at optimum to achieve maximum availability of nutrients. On a medium soil type here, with a soil nitrogen supply index of 2, then we could look to apply anywhere between 140 to 190 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, which would be 112 to 152 units. At a target index 2 for phosphate and a target index 2+ for potash, we would need to apply 55 kilograms per hectare over the year through a form of water-soluble fertiliser or some form of manure. And then lastly, sulphur, where deficient, we should be looking to apply anywhere between up to 50 kilograms per hectare or 40 units of SO3. So that concludes my presentation this evening. Thank you for your time for listening, and I will now hand back to Nigel. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. I would just like to thank all three speakers for their excellent presentations this evening. I thought there was a tremendous amount of information. Hannah with a background to Lancrop's soil analysis service. Kevin with the importance of maintaining soil pH and the interaction of nutrients in the soil on a given pH. And Francis latterly with the interaction of nutrients and seasonal uptake of calcium regarding crops and the acidity of different types of nitrogen applications. So we are now obviously happy to take any questions relating to any of the presentations. I understand that there's been a few questions already sent in, which have been replied to, but in no particular order. I've got a couple that's, several that's come through. So a question here for Hannah asks, when is the best time of year to take soil samples?
Thanks, Nigel. Yeah, I don't think there is any sort of set best time to take a soil sample. The important thing is to make sure that you sample before any nutrients are applied, any organic manures or fertiliser are applied. I mean, the RB209 says 6 months after application before you can analyse. I think that's very difficult to do. I don't think anybody can ever actually manage to not apply anything for 6 months of the year. So I think six weeks will be the absolute minimum following an application nutrient. I think the most important thing to do is to make sure that any analysis you take on the same field is done at the same time of year. So you're comparing like with like. I always think that sort of after the final grazing or cutting or after the harvest is a good time because your nutrients are likely to be at the lowest. So yeah, I would say that, but there's no, we take analysis all year. There's no set time, but just a little bit of thought behind it, it always goes far.
Excellent, thanks, Hannah. Just whilst everybody's still with us, I'd just also like to remind everybody just to take a note of the number at the bottom, which is on the screen, just so that you can claim your CPD points back for basis, etc. So if you can make a note of that, and then you can claim the point back. A question here for Kevin. If my soil analysis is reporting a pH of 5.8 on permanent grassland, would I not be better suited to using conventional agricultural lime than granulated lime to raise my soil pH to target?
It's really a matter of preference at that pH of 5.8. One of the issues that you might have with a pH of 5.8 on established grassland would be the type of lime that you're using. If it's a coarse lime, then you may not be able to get that lime to actually infiltrate into the soil profile, and what you'd end up with if you're putting on 2 tons of the acre of a conventional lime would be over neutralizing that top centimeter or two of soil, because you're just putting so much on and it's so concentrated, and it wouldn't really have the ability to work through the soil profile in that situation. So I'm in that situation, if you were going maybe with a ton of conventional agricultural lime, that would be better, but still maybe not ideal. Granulated lime, because it's so fine and the pellets are dissolved so rapidly, the particles work their way through the soil fissures and get down into the soil profile for an established grassland. That's probably your best bet, and it might take you 2 or 3 years to get there with just a staged increase or staged application, maybe 250 kilos to the acre in year 1, 200 in year 2, and 150 in year 3, and then you're into your maintenance dose from there.
Excellent. Thanks, Kevin. One for Francis. Where crop yield is expected to differ from the standard values in the nutrient management guide, how do you adjust the recommendations?
All right, thanks, Nigel. Okay, so The book standard is 8 tonnes per hectare in the AHDB guide. So those values don't change. All we need to change is the actual yield. So, for example, if we go from an 8 tonne per hectare up to a 10 tonne per hectare, which quite a few people are achieving these days, then we just multiply the offtakes by the increase in the yield by an extra 2. So, for example, winter wheat with straw chopped, so grain offtake only for phosphate, we would multiply the 6.5 kilograms per hectare of phosphate removed by the 10. So it'll be 65 kilos per hectare of P2O5, and then the potash, we'd multiply again 5.5 kilos per hectare of offtake of potash by the 10, so that'll be 55 kilograms per hectare of K2O.
Excellent.
So we just vary it by the actual physical yield it is.
Excellent. Thanks, Francis. Another one for Hannah. How many acres can a soil test cover?
So probably one soil test would be a maximum of 20 acres or 8 hectares. If you've got a huge field and you're doing it on a whole field basis, then yeah, if it was above 20 acres, you'd probably be better off taking 2 samples on that field.
Excellent.
It's an easy one.
Kevin, there seems to be a lot of variability between various government bodies in suggesting ideal soil pH for grassland and arable land. What would be your recommended targets for pH for these crops?
Yes, well, different bodies do have different targets, and I said really when it comes down to it, what you need to consider is that what's coming back on your soil analysis report is an average of the field. So it doesn't mean that if you get your soil test back and it says 6.2, it doesn't mean that the entire field is a pH of 6.2. There'll be areas of that field that may be up to 6.5, and conversely, there may be areas of that field that are at 5.7. So what you really need to do is make sure that you're getting that average up high enough to make sure that the majority of the nutrients that are being applied to the soil are going to be applied. And generally speaking, we would be looking at about 6.3 as a minimum for a grassland, or 6.5 for an arable crop. The only thing I would say maybe a bit different from that is if you're starting to work in some legumes into your grass lays in order to increase the nitrogen recovery from the atmosphere and maybe apply a little bit less chemical nitrogen, you might want to be looking at bringing that pH up closer to an arable range of 6.5, just because legumes tend to be a little bit more susceptible to pH in terms of establishment and yielding really well.
Excellent. Another one for Francis. What is NUE, nitrogen use efficiency, which is talked about a lot currently in the farming press?
All right, okay, thanks, Nigel. So NUE, nitrogen use efficiency, yeah, there's a bit of talk about it at the moment as we obviously have challenges coming down the road with emissions from agricultural. So there's basically, I kind of consider it 2 parts, Nigel. So the first part being efficiency, and I would consider the efficiency the amount of additional crop yield achieved by applying nitrogen. And the second part I would consider the effectiveness, and that would be a ratio of some measure of crop output to the amount of nitrogen that we actually supply to the crop. So I'd break it down to 2 parts: efficiency and effectiveness.
Excellent. Another question that's just come in for Kevin. When is the best time of year to apply granular lime?
Oh, the beauty of granulated lime is it's not nearly as weather dependent as conventional lime for getting it on the ground. It gives you a full lift with it. It starts to work right away, and it gives you a full lift in pH reaction within 6 weeks of application. So you can really, if the weather's not ideal at the start of the year or prior to getting the crop established, you can really get it on at any time and still get the benefit of it in that growing season. But if I was just to give you an ideal perfect time, if you can get out 6 weeks before your application of slurry or your chemical fertilizers on the land and get the granulated lime down at that time, then you'll have amended your pH prior to putting the nutrient on, and make sure that all of the nutrient that you're getting on the soil is going to have the maximum availability. So that would be the ultimate goal.
Excellent. And just a reference here from Andy Cheatham, just mentioning that if you aerate the grass and apply G-lime, it works much quicker and also helps mineralize nitrogen. So obviously somebody speaking there from experience. We currently don't have any more questions coming in. Just conscious of time as well, as this the webinar finishes at 8 o'clock. So happy just to wait, just to see if any more questions come through. Otherwise, we'll conclude this evening's webinar. So I don't know whether anybody else has got any further questions at all. Sorry, one more just come in. Will there be a time when on-farm soil tests can be done as against sending away samples? So whether the analysis could physically be done on farm rather than sending analysis into Lancrop, etc. I suppose that's a question for Hannah.
Yeah, I mean, there are currently quite a few different on-farm testing systems, but I'm going to say this, aren't I? That they're not always as reliable as having the kit in the laboratory that's all properly calibrated and everything else. You know, it's very difficult to actually do it on farm currently. But if it does happen in the future, then obviously it's everything's moving to be more immediate, isn't it? So I suppose it could come. I hope not. I'll be out of a job, but it's yeah. I mean, it could come, but I think at the moment the efficiency and also legislation, they've been quite clear on the SFIs that the organic matter has got to be tested in certain methods. So whilst ever that's happening, then we're going to have to keep doing it under the lab.
Yeah, and I think also from a credibility source as well. Certainly from people like ourselves. Importers, etc. It gives a bit of credibility of the fact it goes to an independent lab for analysis. So there's, nobody can play about with any figures, etc. Just to manipulate the results, etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's pretty much concluding this evening's webinar. Just again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this evening. On behalf of everyone at Kilwaughter, Lancrop and Glasson Fertiliser, I would just like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and hopefully enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.